Today, we are especially fortunate in having Professor Andrew Nicholson with us. A little bit about him first. Andrew is the Stewart Visiting Fellow in Princeton's Department of Religion and an Associate Professor at Stony Brook University, State University of New York. You remember a few months ago, we had Ayon Maharaj visiting here, and he gave a wonderful talk. He was actually invited to New York by Andrew to give a talk in Princeton University. So we got one side of it here and the other side in Princeton University. But both talks are on YouTube, you can see that. Andrew is the author of 2 books and numerous articles on Indian philosophy, intellectual history, and philosophy of religion. His book, Unifying Hinduism, Philosophy and Identity in Indian Intellectual History, 2010, won the American Academy of Religions Prize for Best First Book in History of Religions. Actually, this is the book he is really well known by. And I knew about this book years ago, but I really didn't get around to reading it until last year. It is a wonderful book. It's about a great philosopher called Vijnana Bhikshu, and who, unfortunately, is not studied as seriously as he deserves to be. He was one of the first to have this tradition of synthesizing yoga and Vedanta, very much in the tradition in which Swami Vivekananda also, in his Raja Yoga. It's a synthesis of Patanjali Yoga and Vedanta. And the grand theme of the book is very interesting. There was a theory among European Indologists that Hinduism is something invented by European scholars. Now that's, as we think we look at it from an Indian perspective, that's ridiculous. We've been around for a few thousand years before Europe was Europe, so it can't be invented by European scholars. But the point they made was the term Hinduism and the way we see Hinduism, definitely, we have revised our views about Hinduism over the centuries. So is it modern or pre-modern? And Andrew shows that hundreds of years before all this, Vijnana Bhikshu had a very modern idea about a unified religion, which we today call Hinduism. We, of course, knew it as Sanatana Dharma for millennia. But it shows that this construct, if you can call it so, it's not really modern. I mean, there has been, the seeds of this are in the past, and he showed it in this book, Unifying Hinduism. His second book, the new one, which he's going to speak about today, Lord Shiva's song, the Isvara Gita, is a translation from Sanskrit of an 8th century Shaiva Hindu text. Actually, the Pashupata school, which again we don't know too much about today because it's not so current. And yet, if you look at the old texts, philosophical discussions in the medieval times and ancient times, the Pashupatas were a big force. They were not only big in the religious scene, they were a big religious sect, but philosophically too. Shankara argues against them. I think in the Sarvadarshana Sangraha, it's one chapter, the Pashupatas. So it was a philosophical force too. And this text is an important text of the Pashupata sect and Pashupata philosophy, Shaiva philosophy. And we did not plan it that way. Tomorrow is Shivaratri. So we did not plan it. It just happened. It's such a wonderful coincidence. Professor Nicholson holds degrees in religious studies and MA from the University of Chicago, a degree in philosophy and MA from DePaul University, and his PhD is from the University of Chicago in South Asian Languages and Civilizations. He has also studied Sanskrit, Hindi, Indian philosophy, and yoga with teachers in India. His current research projects examine the history of Vedanta philosophy in medieval and early modern India, Hindu traditions of theistic and anti-theistic argumentation, and Indian ethical and political thought. So, Andrew, you'll come and speak to us about Isvara Gita. You've got the handout and the PowerPoint here. After that, we'll go into Q&A. Andrew, thank you.
So, I'm not going to assume that you have read this text before, which is why I prepared all these handouts and things. So you have something to look at. I'm afraid I do not have a handout. Can I get one of the handouts? Thank you. So, as Swamiji said, Isvara Gita. So Isvara here, most of you probably know Ishvara. Ishvara means Lord. In a similar way to the way that Bhagavan, like the Bhagavad Gita, often refers to Vishnu or Krishna, so too Ishvara or Ishvara often refers to Lord Shiva. And indeed, the text I'll be talking about today, the Isvara Gita, Gita means song, Ishvara, Lord Shiva, therefore Lord Shiva's song. This text comes from one of the Puranas or Mahapuranas. It's the Kurma Purana. It's the Purana or ancient text of the Kurma avatar of Vishnu. And one of the interesting things that we'll be discussing today is how, even though this is supposed to be a Vaishnava text, it's a text about this tortoise incarnation of Vishnu, nonetheless it's full of things about Shiva. And similarly, in texts like Shiva Purana, you find lots of stories about Vishnu and other gods as well. And one of the themes I want to discuss with you is the relationship between these two gods and how Isvara Gita conceives that relationship. So, as Swamiji mentioned, the Pashupatas were a very important sect that rose to prominence in India in the first millennium of the Common Era. And they were really all over India and have enormous influence on lots of different texts, including this text here. So this is a text from the Puranas, but it very clearly shows a kind of influence of the Pashupatas. As your handout says, they worship Shiva in his form as Pashupati. Pashu means a beast, and Pati, master or lord. So he is the master of beasts, and we'll talk a little later about what that might mean to be the master of beasts, the Pashupati. So that's where they get the name Pashupata from. A couple of other texts. I'm sure you've heard of the Bhagavad Gita. I hope you're at the Vedanta Society once or twice, maybe. And so one of the things about Lord Shiva's song is it's very clearly patterned in some ways after the Bhagavad Gita. In fact, one feared 19th century Indologist said it was a mere pale imitation of the Bhagavad Gita. Of course, having translated the text, I would beg to differ. I think there's a lot of new information and interesting insights in the Isvara Gita that are only hinted at in the Bhagavad Gita. But it's very clearly patterned after that text. And I should say there are lots and lots of Gitas. Isvara Gita, Bhagavad Gita, not the only one. You have the Hanuman Gita, the Vyasa Gita, the Ganesha Gita. If you can think of a god, he's got a Gita. And so most of these texts actually do end up in the Puranas, which again I think are texts that maybe don't get the respect they deserve, both from philosophers and historians and from worshippers. I mean, most of what we think of as core Hindu myths are the myths of the Puranas. And similarly, there are lots of wonderful philosophical insights in the Puranas as well. And I should say that I came to this text originally. I'd never heard of it before, but the philosopher I wrote my first book about, Vijnana Bhikshu, did a commentary on the Isvara Gita. And he said, because I've written a commentary on the Isvara Gita, there's no need for me to write a commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, because the essence, the rasa, is the same of both texts. So that's also an interesting thing to note. Vijnana Bhikshu, a Vaishnava, a worshipper of Vishnu, is commenting on a text that appears to be about Shiva. Yoga Sutras, if you haven't read Swami Vivekananda's Raja Yoga, you should go do that immediately. But what's interesting, and we'll talk about in a second, is Vivekananda actually knew this text and patterned, I would argue, part of his teachings of Raja Yoga after the teachings of Isvara Gita, Lord Shiva's song. The Pashupata Sutras are the foundational texts of the Pashupata school. We historians say they were probably compiled between the 2nd and 4th centuries, Common Era. So that's clearly another influence, along with the Yoga Sutras and the Bhagavad Gita, on the Isvara Gita. And we'll be talking more about that too, as well as the laws of Manu Smriti, which it pretty clearly references in some places. So as historians, we know this text came after those texts and creatively drew from those texts. So let's talk a little bit about Isvara Gita and its context. So everyone knows that the Bhagavad Gita is a dialogue between Arjuna, who's having an existential crisis on the battlefield and needs Krishna to answer his questions and help him understand Dharma. The context of Lord Shiva's song is the Badrinath hermitage, or Bdarika as we call it in Sanskrit, and a group of sages who assembled there. So let me read from you from chapter 1, which sort of sets the scene for this. So you can think of it as similar to the first chapter of Bhagavad Gita, where they show all these forces arrayed on the different lines, and Arjuna has his speech. So this text, like the Bhagavad Gita, is narrated by Vyasa. Vyasa is the narrator of the Mahabharata, as well as most of the Puranas. So Vyasa says, Sanat Kumara, Sanaka, Sanandana, and Angiras, along with Rudra and Brigu, the great scholar of Dharma, Karnada, Kapila, the yogi, the great sage Vamadeva, Shukra, and glorious Vashishta, all masters of mental discipline, consulted one another, their minds penetrated by doubt. They practiced fearsome austerities at the holy Badarika hermitage. So they're at Badrinath, they're practicing austerities, but they're confused. They need some help. Even these great sages like Kapila, the mythical founder of the Samkhya system, is confused, which is interesting. So who do you think is going to come and answer their confusion? It might not be who you think. So it's interesting because Badarika hermitage is often associated with Narayana or Vishnu, or especially the Nara-Narayana pair, the twin incarnations of Nara and Narayana. And they are the ones who first appear. So in chapter 1, these sages see Narayana appearing first. You could think of, if you go to a comedy club or a show, sometimes they have a warm-up act before the main act. Narayana is the warm-up act for Isvara, which some Vaishnavas might not be too happy with, but he's the warm-up act here, okay? So he's the warm-up act, and this is what they ask Narayana, who appears first at this hermitage. What is the cause of this whole universe? Who is reborn time and time again? What is the self and what is liberation? What causes the cycle of rebirth? Who is the Lord who causes others to be reborn? Who sees everything? What is the highest Brahman? Please explain all of this to us. So all these great sages who have founded schools of philosophy and have, achieved these heights of great siddhis or yogic powers, they're all confused at this hermitage and they need the help of Narayana. But just as Narayana is about to speak, in a flash of light, Shiva or Ishvara appears. And this is where it gets a little interesting as a historian. Some people have said, well, perhaps this was first a text about Vishnu, and then these ideas about Shiva were interpolated or brought into the text. But whatever the case may be, it's very clear that in this text, Vishnu and Shiva are not enemies, they are best friends. So a golden couch descends from the sky, and for the entire discourse of Shiva, he and Narayana are sitting together on this big golden couch, looking at each other admiringly. And that's not a coincidence. I think there are good reasons why they want to portray Shiva and Narayana, or Vishnu, not as enemies or, having different ideas, but basically having the same philosophy. And this is a tendency we find throughout the Puranas. Of course, there were lots of sects and they disagreed about a lot of things. The Pashupatas were actually pretty notorious, I would say, for some of their practices in ancient India. But in texts like the Kurma Purana and Isvara Gita, they bring these different groups together and synthesize them in a way very similar to the way the Vijnana Bhikshu or Swami Vivekananda synthesized many diverse traditions to bring them together as a single unified teaching. So that's another interesting feature of Isvara Gita, Lord Shiva's song. So I'm mostly interested in the final chapter of this text, which is the chapter on yoga. That's also the one that Swami Vivekananda was most interested in. But before I tell you about that, I wanted to give you a glimpse of a few other passages that you might find interesting. So as many of you know, in the Bhagavad Gita, there is this vision of the universal form of Krishna in chapter 11, the Vishvarupa, right? Well, this is a Gita too, and every Gita needs a good Vishvarupa. And so in the 5th chapter of Lord Shiva's song, we do find the Vishvarupa of Ishvara, of Lord Shiva. But it's a different kind of Vishvarupa. See if you can see what's going on here. So this is, it's not on your handouts, but I thought you'd enjoy this. seeing as Shivratri is tomorrow night. So chapter 5, which I gave the title, The Lord's Dance. They didn't have title chapters in ancient India, but to help people nowadays, we give title chapters. So Vyasa says this. They, the great sages, saw the Master, the great God, a supreme storehouse of light, dancing with Vishnu in the immaculate sky. In the sky, they truly saw the Lord of beings, known by yogis with disciplined minds who know the reality of yoga. The sages saw the dancing one himself. This whole world belongs to him. It is made up of magical power, Maya. He sets it in motion. They saw him, the dancing one, by recalling him and his lotus feet. People are freed from fear, which arises out of ignorance. They saw that yogi, those who are free from fatigue, breath subdued, calm, and full of devotion. Such people see him as pure light. They saw Rudra, the liberator in the sky, gracious and loving to his devotees. Quickly, he frees them from ignorance. And it goes on in this vein, but the big difference is Krishna is whatever he's doing in chapter 11, to the best of my knowledge, he's not dancing. Shiva, as Nataraja, is dancing in the sky. And who is he dancing with? His best friend Vishnu. So if you've ever been to the Met Museum, as I'm sure most of you New Yorkers have, you know this image from the 11th century, it's a chola bronze of Shiva Nataraja. So this is the kind of text that these sculptors would have had in mind when they created this beautiful image of Shiva as the Lord who is responsible in his dance for everything. If you're a Pashupata, you believe he's not just the destroyer. This is a mistake I think people make. For a Shaiva, for a Pashupata, he is the creator, he is the preserver, he is the destroyer, he is everything. And all these other gods, like Brahma, the creator god, are just aspects of him. And you find, again, something similar in the 11th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, where all these different gods are portrayed as being inside of the body of Krishna himself. So something similar, something's a little bit different in the Isvara Gita. Another feature of the 5th chapter, this image of his Vishvarupa, is in the beginning they say he's dancing with Vishnu. But a little later, he and Vishnu are merged into the form that nowadays we know as Hari Hara. So if this is a kind of small image, but if you know or have seen this before, on one side you have Shiva, you can see on the right side his matted locks and his snake. They even have half of his Ajna Chakra, his third eye. Half of it is there. The other half is missing because the other half is Vishnu. So by the end of the 5th chapter, not only are they dancing together, they've merged into one being. They are, according to this text, the same being. And this is what, at the very end of the text, Shiva says. He speaks out against those who might think of him and Vishnu as being two different beings. So this is chapter 11. After he's done his great teaching of yoga, he gives a warning. I do not abide in those who see me as other, thinking that he, Vishnu, and I are different gods. They go to horrible hells. I liberate those who take refuge in me, the fool and the scholar, the Brahmin and the dog cooker, but not one who reviles Narayana. Therefore, to give me pleasure, my devotees should praise and honor him, the highest spirit, the great yogi. So there's a lot going on here. Some of you may be familiar with the Svapaka, dog cooker, someone who's a Dalit, who's the lowest of the most impure. Even he can be saved. Even that person who in traditional India was considered so impure, he would cook and eat dogs. But not one who reviles Vishnu or considers Vishnu to be different than Shiva. So again, we have this very powerful statement of what we scholars nowadays would call inclusion, inclusivism. This is not tolerance. As Swami Vivekananda said, who wants to be tolerated, right? I tolerate you, that's nothing, right? You want to be embraced by this other person or a member of another religion. And I think we can see here this spirit of inclusion, which we find in this 8th century text, we find in many modern Hindu traditions as well. I'm not going to tolerate Jesus Christ or tolerate Muhammad. I'm going to embrace them as being part of the same reality, the same spiritual quest that I myself am on. And I think that's also a very important resonance in this text, and one that we find in the teachings of Vivekananda and Ramakrishna very, very clearly enunciated. And we're not all different religions fighting against each other trying to win. It's not a competition, right? Liberation is not, winner take all, everyone else doesn't get liberated. That's not how it works. So this is, I think, a very strong statement of inclusion, and it might be surprising because the Pashupatas are remembered for not being inclusive at all. This is a sect that went out of their way to condemn other sects, not just worshippers of Vishnu, but even other types of Shiva worship they considered to be lesser or below them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these Pashupatas and how this text transforms this Pashupata teaching into a kind of inclusive message. So, let's see here. So this is a statement from Kaundinya's commentary on the Pashupata Sutras. So just like you have Yoga Sutras or Samkhya Sutras, you've got Pashupata Sutras, and the commentary is by Kaundinya, who probably lived around the 4th century, which is around the same time as other famous commentators like Patanjali were living, roughly the same time. And he does not like what he calls Samkhya Yoga very much. Another name for Samkhya Yoga is Patanjala Yoga. It may shock some people to know Patanjali was not universally loved in first millennium India. Quite the contrary. There were lots of different sects practicing lots and lots of different forms of yoga, and some of them condemned what they called Samkhya Yoga or Patanjala Yoga, the teachings of Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. And this commentator on the Pashupata Sutra was one of them. So he said, "It has been said that those who are liberated by Samkhya Yoga and who are masters of Samkhya Yoga should be all remembered as beasts, from the god Brahma down to the bird." These people are beasts. They are pashus. So what is a pashu? Well, according to these early Shaiva groups, there are 3 important categories you have to understand. So remember we talked about Pashupati, the Lord of Beasts. So most of us in this room, with the exception of Swamiji, are Pashus. We are unliberated souls. I can't speak for you. Maybe you can tell us later. But we have not been liberated yet. We are bound. And we are bound in fetters, pashas. And who are we bound by? Well, ultimately, according to the Pashupatas, everything comes from the Lord Shiva. So he's the one who binds us, but he is the one who also liberates us through his grace, through his anugraha. So this was a very devotionally oriented sect. They did not just sit around meditating, but also singing and dancing and having a kind of ecstatic relationship with Lord Shiva. Similar to the way if you've been to Union Square, you see the members of ISKCON having this ecstatic singing and dancing and worshiping Lord Krishna. Well, that's how they had a relationship with Lord Shiva. And so they believed that these other groups, like these followers of Samkhya Yoga, Patanjali's yoga, which is largely, I would say, most scholars believe, based on this dualistic system, that on the one hand you have nature, prakriti, on the other hand you have purusha, spirit, and liberation is about separating these two things. So yoga is actually viyoga according to Samkhya. It's about the separation. It seems kind of contradictory, but the separation of these two things. And if you read Patanjali carefully, in his own words, without looking at these later Vedantic commentaries like Vijnana Bhikshu's, that seems to be what's going on. The Pashupatas and many other groups thought that was terrible. Shankara thought that was terrible. When you read Shankara's commentary in the Brahma Sutra, he says the same thing. These guys, they've got it completely wrong. They don't understand this unity that goes beyond this apparent duality of Purusha and Prakriti. Well, according to the Pashupatas, the unity is not a unity in Brahman as a kind of formless reality, but the unity in Shiva himself. He is the absolute. So according to the Yoga Sutra, you may be familiar with this, Yogas Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Yoga is a cessation, Nirodha, of your Chitta Vrittis, your mental twirlings, your mental activities, right? This doesn't say yoga is about God. Patanjali doesn't say that. He said other things about God elsewhere we can talk about later, but he doesn't say that's what yoga is. However, when we get to Kaundinya, he says, Atmeshvara samyogo yogaha pratyetavyaha. Yoga should be understood, pratyetavyaha, as the samyoga, the union of the Atma, the individual self, and Isvara, God. That's what yoga is. So this, when you go to yoga class, they tell you yoga is about union with God. It's not in Patanjali. Where is it? It's in texts like the Pashupata Sutras. So this idea of yoga as a joining together with God, something not only found in this text, you find it in the Bhagavad Gita, you find it throughout other Vaishnava works, but here it's very clearly enunciated in this commentary on the Pashupata Sutra. Yoga is about union with God. So I'll tell you a little bit more about these Pashupatas. You're probably not going to get this information from anybody else, so I better do this while I'm here. So let's see here. There were 3 stages of the Pashupata Vrata, or the Pashupata vow. In the first stage, the Pashupata should live at or near a Shiva temple, should bear the mark of the Pashupata ascetic by bathing in ash. This is another famous thing that Pashupatas did. They took baths in ash. And to worship Shiva with song, dance, laughter, and mantra repetition. The initiate also adopts a set of moral precepts similar to those outlined in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, including ahimsa, non-harming, celibacy, brahmacharya, and truthfulness, satya. The idea of yogis singing and dancing defies the common stereotype of yogis as solitary, stationary, and solely concerned with inward contemplation. Furthermore, these were not mere spontaneous gestures of devotion or simple oral folk traditions. Kaundinya, the commentator, says that the singing of the Pashupata yogi should be, quote, in accord with the Gandharva Shastra, unquote, and his dancing, quote, in accord with the Natya Shastra, presumably meaning the classic work composed by Bharata. So if you've been to a Bharatanatyam performance, that's what these guys were doing in the 8th century, smeared in ash, devoting themselves to Lord Shiva. Although these passages may force us to adjust our ideas of what is proper behavior for a yogi, on second thought, it should hardly be surprising that medieval yogis would include training in dance as part of the path to union with God. So Shiva is Lord of the dance, and is this form that's portrayed in the 5th chapter of the Isvara Gita. So, of course, if your goal is to imitate God, imitatio Dei, as the Latin mystics called it, and what is Shiva? He's the great dancer, so of course you're going to dance like Shiva, right? It should go without saying. So all this stuff about yogis never dancing, that's nonsense. Or as Emma Goldman was supposed to have said, you've heard this one, I don't want to be part of any revolution that won't let me dance, right? So I'm not going to be part of any sect of Hinduism that doesn't let me dance and sing. Not only are you allowed to, you are supposed to. You're supposed to study the Gandharva Shastra and the Natya Shastra, to sing and dance. The second of the three stages was the most controversial. This is the one that a lot of their enemies criticize them for. The Pashupatas transgressed the normal conventions of society, and doing so in some ways that might remind us of the cynics in ancient Greece. So during this stage, the Pashupata yogi discards his mark of the Pashupata ascetic. He wipes off his ashes, enters the public square snoring, trembling, limping, and making obscene gestures to women, babbling as if drunk or insane. So you guys have been on the New York subway, right? You've seen these people. Those are Pashupata yogis. And according to some traditions, the way that they gain merit is through other people reviling them. So if you spit on one of these Pashupatas on the C train, or say, get away, you're disgusting, they are absorbing your good karma that you are losing. So by doing these things, they are actually gaining karma by taking this abuse. And the reason I think this is interesting is because it shows that the path of liberation requires getting rid of these trappings of greatness and holiness and spirituality. You wipe off all these marks of your status as a holy man and look for people abusing you. And this is reminiscent of some later tantric traditions. These Pashupatas were pre-tantric, but certainly in later times this idea that the worshipper should go beyond the norms of polite society, and more importantly, not care about what other people think. You don't want to have a high status. This egoism, this thinking, oh, I'm a big man, I'm Barda Admi, and everyone else is lower than me, that itself is an impediment to liberation. So this is a lot of what the second stage of the Pashupata Vrata was about. So after he's engaged in this kind of spiritual exercise of, as it's called in Kaundinya, learning to despise praise like a poison. That's an interesting statement. They want to despise praise. They don't want your praise. Your praise is going to bind them here to the earth. They want your blame. They want to be humbled, right? So after this second stage of a kind of purification through other people reviling you, then finally in the third stage, the adept withdraws from society and moves into a vacant house or cave. After 6 months of uninterrupted meditation on the syllable Om and on Shiva, he moved to a cremation ground. There he achieves complete union with Shiva, cutting off karma at its root. By grace of Shiva, he achieves the end of suffering and eternal freedom. So this is the path of the Pashupatas, which I think has been mocked or misunderstood, but from my perspective, I think there's a lot there that we can learn from these Pashupatas. But what I don't agree with is they're reviling all of these other groups like the followers of Patanjali. Fortunately, in the text we have today, they have a somewhat different attitude towards Patanjali's yoga, just as they had a very inclusive attitude towards worshippers of Vishnu. So we've seen these two definitions, yoga as a cessation of mental activity, Patanjali's definition. The commentary on the Pashupata Sutra, union of the self and God. Well, let's see now what the definition of yoga we find in the Isvara Gita is. So chapter 11 is the famous chapter on yoga, the most widely cited chapter. In Vivekananda's Complete Works, Volume 1, Chapter 8, the chapter is entitled Raja Yoga in Brief, and it is actually Vivekananda's summary of the teachings of chapter 11 in the Isvara Gita. So it's very clear that he not only knew this, but I believe was influenced in his own presentation of yoga. Another thing I believe, I can't prove it, but I suspect if you know Swami Vivekananda talks about not just 3 yogas, like most commentators on the Bhagavad Gita do, he actually talks about 4 yogas. The fourth, of course, being Raja Yoga. Well, the Isvara Gita also has 4 yogas. It says in verse 24, chapter 4, some discern me through meditation, others through knowledge, jnana, some through the yoga of devotion, bhakti yoga, and others through the yoga of action, karma yoga. We've got 4 yogas there, not 3 yogas. So this may be one place where, and here it's called dhyana yoga, but it may be the inspiration for the idea of the Raja Yoga as the 4th path. And certainly in the 18th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, they do mention dhyana yoga, but there are so many yogas. There's Buddhi yoga, there's, many different yogas, but usually when medieval commentators like Madhusudana Sarasvati talk about the Bhagavad Gita, they divide it into 3 yogas: Bhakti yoga, Jnana yoga, and Karma yoga. So this 4th yoga is something that, may have been an influence on Vivekananda. But certainly the 11th chapter was an influence on Vivekananda. So let's talk about it. The first section of the 11th chapter introduces 2 fundamental yogas. It says, this is verse 11.5, yoga is known to be of 2 kinds. The first is considered the yoga of non-being, abhava yoga. The other is the great yoga, maha yoga, the very best of all yogas. So we have 2 yogas. There's abhava yoga. This doesn't mean Buddhist yoga or annihilating yourself. That's not what abhava yoga is. Well, what is this yoga of non-being, abhava? Verse 5 in chapter 11 says, the yoga in which one's own essence is known to be empty, free from false appearances, is named the yoga of non-being, abhava. Through it, one sees the self. So this is a kind of preparatory yoga. And this looks a lot to me like Patanjali's yoga, right? This is the yoga. It doesn't tell you what you are. It tells you what you're not. Abhava. What am I not? I am not this body. I'm not my feelings. I'm not anger. I'm not my clever intellect. Whatever I am, it's not that. I've figured that out through Patanjali's yoga. So remember this V-yoga we were talking about? You're separating yourself from these things we usually identify as self. My memories or my intellect or my thoughts or my handsome, beautiful, whatever. That's the thing that we have to get rid of with abhava yoga. Getting rid of this attachment to these ephemeral things, which we know are not us because they are not eternal, right? So once we've done that, what's left? Well, this is where the Maha Yoga comes in. So in verse 6. The yoga in which one discerns the self as eternally blissful, free from blemish, and united with me is called the great yoga of the Supreme Lord. So this is what's missing in Patanjali. This is a much more polite way of pointing this out than saying you Samkhya yogis are beasts, right? They're saying, your yoga is good, but it's incomplete. After you've done this kind of abhava yoga, you need to do the great yoga, which is union with the individual self and Ishvara, Atmeshvara Samyoga, right? And there's some clever things going on. I don't know if we have time to talk about all of them, but he goes through the famous 8 limbs of Patanjali, but there's a little Pashupata spin on a lot of these 8 limbs because, so for instance, Ishvara Pranidhana, we scholars fight constantly over this word Pranidhana. What does it mean, Pranidhana? He doesn't even use this word. The author of this text says Ishvara Pujana. We all know what puja is, right? Pujana. So they define Ishvara Pujana as, one moment here, worship of the Lord, Ishvara Pujana, is unshakable devotion, bhakti, to Shiva through praise, remembrance, and worship, done in speech, mind, and body, respectively. So it's not abstract meditation, sitting on your cushion, contemplating the whatever. You're boogieing, you're dancing. It's in your body, right? This is not disembodied. I think probably starting from Rachiya Iliada, so many people have thought about yoga as being this kind of disembodied thing you do. Well, here it's bodily, right? So Isvara Pujana is praise, remembrance, and worship done in speech. Speech is the praise part. Mind, remembrance, and body. So this physical worship one does. One sings, one dances, one rings bells, all the things we're used to from going to these temples, right? That's also part of this path of Isvara Pranidhana, which many of you know, is one of the 5 niyamas. So what I would translate as observances in the second stage of Patanjali's yoga. So here it's very, I still don't know what it is in Patanjali, but here it's very clear that Isvara Pranidhana means Isvara Pujana. This kind of not just mental, but physical worship of the Lord. Another clever thing going on here is a redefinition of what yoga is. So here we recognize our 8 limbs. They're out of order. Sorry about that. Sometimes when you're writing in verse, you have to kind of change the verses around to make the words fit. But these are the yama, niyama, asana, pranayama, pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, samadhi. These are the 8 limbs in Patanjali, out of order. So verse 11, chapter 11. Breath control, meditation, sense withdrawal, concentration, absorption, abstentions, observances, and posture. Best of sages, yoga is the focusing of the mind solely on me through cessation of other mental activity. I have just told you its 8 means. So think back to Patanjali. Yoga is a cessation of mental activity. Here, yoga is not cessation of all mental activity. It's cessation of all mental activity other than focusing one's mind on Shiva to attain this samyoga, this Atmeshvara samyoga. So that was what was missing in Patanjali's yoga. You eliminate all mental activity, all chitta vritti, what have you got? Nothing, according to Pashupatas. What you need is this union that comes through this one-pointed absorption, or ekachittata, on Shiva. So you see here a kind of fusion of these 2 definitions I gave you previously, right? The cessative aspect, the cessation of mental activities, but not all mental activities. And through this, you achieve the highest goal, which is moksha, liberation, and union with Shiva. So this has all been very abstract. I wanted to give you one final, something to take home. These you can do at home. So this is a visualization exercise from the 11th chapter of the Isvara Gita. It's also written on the back of your handout there, so if you want to use it to meditate later today, feel free. So many of these, what we call Ati Marga, or the pre-tantric sects of Shaivism, engaged in elaborate visualization exercise that might remind you of the kinds of visualizations you find in tantric Shaiva yoga, or for that matter, Tibetan Buddhism, where it's all about visualizing these elaborate pictures and portraits and placing yourself and God in this picture. So this is what we have starting at verse 53. Binding himself in the svastika, lotus, or half posture, his gaze resting evenly on the tip of his nose, with eyes slightly open, calm and free from fear, he renounces this world, consisting of magical power. He concentrates on the Supreme Lord, the God who resides in his own self. He then visualizes a lotus, 12 fingers long, from the root of his top knot. So imagine these worshippers, they would have top knots, again, like the ISKCON members. So this is a thumb width. So imagine a flower, 12 thumb widths from the top of your head. It is beautiful, blooming from the bulb that is Dharma. Its stalk is knowledge, the lordly powers, its 8 petals. It is completely white. Renunciation is its seed cup. In that seed cup, he should visualize a sublime golden treasure. Consisting of all the powers, directly they call it Om, the divine eternal syllable, the unmanifest, surrounded by a network of rays. There he should think of a pure, supreme, eternal light. In that light, he places his own self, which is identical to it. He should visualize the Lord, highest cause, standing in the middle of space. At last, becoming the all-pervading Lord himself, he visualizes nothing. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation. And just something for everybody, in case you didn't pick up on that, Swami Vivekananda used this text extensively. Andrew mentioned it a couple of times. I have seen it in Raja Yoga, and it says Kurma Purana. I never connected it with Isvara Gita. My question is, what is the relationship of the Pashupata doctrine with the schools of Vedanta? I mean, philosophically speaking, identity or difference in identity or dualism. For example, Sri Ramakrishna in the Gospel,
Yes.
he says, he has a very interesting statement. He says, Pash Baddha Jeev, Pash Mukto Shib. In fetters, it is Jiva. In
Right.
Pasha. Pasha means fetters, so
Right.
it's in Pasha is Jiva. The same entity freed from fetters is Shiva. That's an identity statement, something like a Kashmiri Shaiva might say. Here it seems to be more like the later Vishishta Advaita. You realize yourself as consciousness and then merge with the higher consciousness,
Right.
which is.
Yeah.
So, what is the relationship?
Okay, so that's a great question, and it's really complicated. But I'll try to give the short answer. Surprise, surprise. So the Puranas are very syncretic. They're sucking up like a vacuum cleaner all of these different things and mixing them together. And then it's up to commentators like Vijnana Bhikshu to try to figure out what the heck it's all about. So certainly Vijnana Bhikshu, he was a realist philosopher of the Bheda school of Vedanta, the difference and non-difference that says that both difference and non-difference are real. And I would say that something like that is also the Pashupata philosophy. They're realists. They're not anti-realists like Adi Shankaracharya was. He thought the whole world is essentially maya or avidya, at least seen from the highest perspective. So they are realists who believe that there is a real union of the individual self, the Atma, and Shiva, which is different from Kashmiri Shaivism or this non-dual Shaivism, of course, because they said, well, ultimately there's just one thing. There's nothing, if you want to have a union, you need at least two things to unify, right? So what you have instead with these Kashmir Shaiva traditions is a realization that we were always already one with Shiva. That is not the case for the Pashupatas. So if you're familiar with Shaiva Siddhanta, which is very much still a living tradition in India, I would say they're close to the Shaiva Siddhanta tradition. Of course, Shaiva Siddhanta also has this teaching of the Pasha, the fetter, the Pashu, the beast, and Patti. And so there's a lot of continuity, I would say. Of all the extant traditions of Shaivism, I would say the Pashupatas are closest philosophically to Shaiva Siddhanta. It's a realist system. It believes, from one perspective, we are all the same as Shiva. From another perspective, we are different than Shiva. And the goal is an actual unification, which is different than just realizing you are always already unified. So that's the short answer to your complex question, which is a very good question. Yes, please.
Thank you for your wonderful representation. I think it's very unique and original in some ways. My question is that here we see Nataraja. Nataraja is the dancing god. He's
Yes.
the creator and destroyer.
Indeed.
And man images God in his man imagines that God is somewhat in human form. So is that the theme of this Isvara Gita? The other thing I was amazed that the first paragraph's questions that you had with this discourse between all the sages and then Narayana and the Shiva comes in, and the questions you raised.
Yes.
And what are the answers? Do you have summarized?
Read the book. This is why you need to go buy my cut translation of the book.
Does it give
They're
more
not my
questions?
answers, they're their answers. You go read, seriously. So if you want to read the book, you
All
can.
right.
I skipped, you're right. It's so rich, there's so much going on here. I focus primarily on chapters 5 and 11, but there's a lot of philosophical stuff going on in between, which is partly what we were just talking about. So I guess part of your question is, does God have human form? Or yeah. So what is Brahman? Yes. Well, I think it's very clear that Brahman is not this kind of nirguna, abstract Brahman beyond all form. Most traditions of Vedanta and most traditions like the Pashupatas are very critical of this idea that somehow there could be this formless reality. Because how could we human beings who have forms and minds have any access to that reality, right? So Shankara, I hate to break it to you, was definitely a minority, and many folks, like Vijnana Bhikshu, would call him a prachanna Bauddha, a closeted Buddhist, because he seemed dangerously close to these Buddhist doctrines, like the doctrine of mind only, chitta matra, for instance, and they were very uncomfortable with these anti-realist kinds of positions. So they were not anti-realists. They do talk about maya sometimes. This is another very tricky thing to translate. I translated in this text as maya as magical power, and the mayin as the magician. So God is the magician who creates this world through his magical power. And I think if you look at older uses of the word maya, this maya does not refer usually to this world. It refers to God's power to create forms that might delude or trick us. That doesn't mean the world's not real. It just means the world isn't real in the way we usually take it. So if you're an atheist or believe in science and not religion or something, you might think everything is separate and nothing matters and there's no purpose or something like that, right? That is what Maya is. So we are all simultaneously parts of the Absolute, which for them is Shiva, but we are also cut off. Suffering is real. Our suffering is not just some kind of, puppet show or something. Suffering is real. And one of the reasons I like realist traditions, like the Pashupatas, like Beda Vedanta, is they take the fact that people are suffering seriously and don't just say, oh, you're just ignorant. If you knew better, you'd know you weren't suffering. We're really suffering. And we really need to find a way out of that suffering. And the union of ourselves and God is something that really happens. So God, yes, does have bodies. He can take human form or human-like form, like this fellow right here. But, of course, he's not limited by that form in the way most of us are limited. So he has wondrous powers. He has siddhis. He can manifest in any form he wants. In another way, you could say this entire universe is part of his body, but it doesn't exhaust his body. So sometimes the Pope accuses Hinduism of being pantheistic. I would say it's more accurate to say it's panentheistic. The entire universe is inside of Shiva, inside of his body, but it doesn't exhaust what he is. He's also more than that. So, like I said, it's a big. Those are big questions, and I don't know if I'll be able to answer them all here. But I can tell you that for these gentlemen, the Pashupatas say the world is real, and that something happens. The world is not just static. And what happens, hopefully, if we practice this path with its 3 stages I mentioned, we can achieve an actual samyoga or union with Lord Shiva. So that's the basic metaphysics, I would say. I hope it starts to answer your question.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
I think in Indian philosophy or in literature,
Yes.
they have this image of Nataraja where they says that life is like that, creation and destruction. This is a dance of life
Absolutely.
or dance of God.
Yes. Any monotheistic tradition, this is a monotheistic tradition, will say God is just not just responsible for the happy stuff, the puppies and the babies being born. He's responsible for the death. He's responsible for children in cages at the southern border of the United States. And this is a difficult problem. How can we reconcile what we think of as a loving God with even those destructive, or we would call them evil, aspects of God? This is truly troubling. But I think what's important to emphasize is that when you read the textbook, it says, oh, Shiva's the destroyer. No, for these people, he's not just the destroyer. That's just one aspect of what Shiva truly is.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Please.
I think you touched on this, but I'm going to ask this again and request that you explain in practical terms. cessation of all mental activity
Yes,
versus focusing only on Shiva
right,
or the Shiva.
right.
Ultimately, I would think that it would converge at some point.
Uh-huh.
And can you explain how that might possibly happen?
Sure. So I think they would say that it's not the same thing, that Samkhya Yoga or Patanjali's yoga is not equal to this Atmeshvara Samyoga. Because Patanjali, he certainly talks about Ishvara, and it's a big controversy who Ishvara is in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. I think there's been a tendency, going back even in the medieval era, to read Patanjali's yoga in light of Vedanta. That's what Vijnana Bhikshu does. He says, who is Ishvara? Ishvara is Vishnu, right? But I, as a historian, would say that is probably not what Patanjali had in mind. And so, he talks about these, when you get to the 8th stage, samadhi, there's sampragnata and asampragnata samadhi. Asampragnata is a samadhi that doesn't have any support or base, kind of abstract meditation. It is not, as Patanjali himself presents it, a meditation on God. It is a kind of abstract meditation where all the chitta vrittis, all these mental whirlings, have ceased, right? For these folks, they would say that is not sufficient. That is helpful, but it is not enough because something is missing. So you could say this is a tendency of a lot of these theistic schools, especially theistic Shaiva schools. They start from Samkhya. As we know, Samkhya has these 25 principles of tattvas. They say, well, that's good, but we need to build on top of this. That's not enough. So who is it who unites the Prakriti and the Purusha? According to these theistic schools, including the Isvara Gita, they can't unite themselves. They need something else. Who is that? Ishvara, or Vishnu, if you read the Vishnu Purana. And so he's the one who shakes, who agitates Prakriti and Purusha at the beginning of the cycle of creation and brings them together. And so he's the 26th principle. Sometimes they talk, instead of 25 tattvas, they talk about 26 tattvas in the Puranas. And this Lord, whoever you identify him as, usually Vishnu or Shiva, is the 26th. If you get to Kashmir Shaivism, as we were just mentioning, they actually have 36 principles. So they build this entire edifice of 11 more things on top of the original 25 things. So I think it's clear that for these folks, they either are completely dismissive of Patanjali, as the commentator on the Pashupata Sutra was, or they think it's a good start, but it's not enough. So, one of the nice things about these traditions is instead of just saying, oh, you're all going to hell, you're useless, they won't say that. They'll say, well, this is a kind of preparatory step leading to a higher possibility. In this case, Atmeshvara Samyoga. So that is their understanding. It may not be Vivekananda's understanding or our understanding, but that is how these pre-modern Pashupatas understood the relationship. So, it's very clear. Patanjali is not enough. I know everyone says Patanjali is the classical yoga, he's so wonderful. It is what it is. From my perspective, it's kind of Samkhya yoga. It's a yoga that's based on the Samkhya school. And if we reject the dualism of Samkhya, as I personally do, then we would say that's perhaps there's lots of good practical information, lots of good psychological insights, but the metaphysical foundation of the text may be problematic. And that's clearly what these folks thought.
So going along the same lines of the previous person who asked
Yes.
the question, in your slide on 11.5 and 11.6, you did talk about those 2 steps to union. So the first, according to Patanjali Yoga, is understanding
the yoga of
yoga of non-being.
Yeah.
But that's not enough, you said.
Right.
And the union of. So what does what you have read
Yes.
tell you about the second step? What do they say we should do to become one with God? If cessation of mental activity. My understanding was, if the cessation of mental activity and you see your inner light and you automatically become, realize.
Right. That's what Patanjali would say, right? He'd say that you don't need God. God is optional. God helps, but you can do it without God. which is why, I would say that.
No, but some of
Yeah.
us who believe, let's say, in Lord
Yeah.
Shiva, we meditate on Lord Shiva
Right.
in the lotus of our heart, so to speak.
Exactly.
So is that what the second step
That's
is?
exactly what the second, you're doing it already. This is the thing, is I'm afraid that maybe Patanjali had a really good PR agent or something, because everyone thinks that the yoga that most Hindus perform today is based on Patanjali. It is not based on Patanjali. You know what it's based on? It's based on these Shaiva traditions yogas, which is Atmeshvara Samyoga. So you are a Pashupata without knowing you're a Pashupata, I think. You're an anonymous Pashupata. So seriously, Patanjali's yoga is not the majority understanding of yoga in medieval India. These theistic yogas, whether it's Vaishnava or Shaiva, are far, far more important and popular and influential. And they are the things that influenced the modern yogas today, both the kinds of postural yoga. Those come out of certain Shaiva practices where we haven't even talked about asana. Asana is not as important for these fellows, but they do practice some form of asana. But those later asana based yogas started around the 11th century in texts like the Dattashreya Yoga Shastra that are, in fact, Shaiva traditions as well. So almost all of the major yoga traditions we have nowadays in the world, I would say, are based on one form of Shaiva yoga or another, and not Patanjali's yoga. But thanks to these PR guys, they gave Patanjali this big, big reputation, and now, he's the classical yoga. What does that even mean? I don't even know what the word, how do you translate classical into Sanskrit? There's no word for classical in Sanskrit. This is a Western Indological construction, I would say, of this one yoga as this is the main yoga. Sure, texts like this, they draw from Patanjali, but they also say it's not enough. And truly, the yoga that you're doing with meditation on Shiva is the yoga, more or less, that they're describing here.
Professor Nicholson, I am amazed with your knowledge, because I do not have knowledge about anything, but first admit that. But from Vedantic standpoint, I have very limited knowledge, but I understood so far from your story, the sages, the big sages were in doubt. Vishnu and Shiva appeared in before of Narayan, the
Right.
flashing light. That is the resolution to me
Yes.
that Brahman, the absolute is Brahman, the flashing light is the result. Why we have problem here, no problem, because now these sages could understand very easily these figures and forms are all false, the lighting flash is the answer.
Right.
If you close the eyes, that's the problem. Is it true or false what I think? That the flashing light you indicated in the story,
Right.
that is our resolution or not?
So certainly, when we want to understand Brahman, one of the ways we do so is by using light as a way of accessing it. Yes. But honestly, I don't think in that particular instance, in the first chapter, they're just at the very beginning of their learning path, right? There's poof, you've seen, a magician appear in a flash of light and suddenly he's on stage. So Isvara is the Mayan, he's the magician, he has these wondrous siddhis and powers. Poof, he creates this big flash of light. And he can also do things like show his Vishvarupa that will create a sense of awe or wonder or establish who he really is, similarly to what we see in the 11th chapter of Bhagavad Gita. So that particular light, I think, is a magic trick, and not the light of Brahman. Yes.
And see Ramakrishna,
Yes.
he doesn't have to, he played
Yes.
Leela, but he was born with that light.
Right.
In that case, I am thinking, I'm not 100% because
Yes.
sages are already trying to reach close to Brahmans. They
Yes.
don't have to go through the Leela process. They are already liberated themselves from downstream. In that case, they are all together. They don't have to go through all the Leelas. The flashing light came in my mind. I don't know, because Sri Ramakrishna doesn't need anything.
Sure.
If we understood him from the beginning, he has the light. Brahman is with him. And in that case, he doesn't have to go through this and the Leela. And that's why I think the first, I have no idea, I am thinking.
Right.
So from Vedantic standpoint, maybe in that stage, they cross the boundaries. That's why they showed that goddess and the Brahman are the same. They came like dancing form or something. It is my assumption.
Right.
I have no
Right.
idea. That's why I'm asking you.
So in Sanskrit,
But
we
yeah.
have this word Jivan Mukta, someone who is liberated, Mukta, even while they are alive. Jivan, it's a present participle, living. And I think very clearly, according to the traditions that follow Ramakrishna, he is a Jivan Mukta. Yeah. Right. Right.
Take time to
But
understand him.
these sages, this is what's interesting. I mentioned you'd think these sages were also Jivan Muktas, but they are really, really confused. And they're not just confused and full of philosophical doubt. They're performing these really, really intense austerities. Tapas. Tapas, as you know, is another one of the niyamas, right? So things like standing on one foot for days at a time. These are this is not like happy yoga asanas. These are extreme, unpleasant yoga asanas. Doing these things because they think this is the way to liberation. It reminded me a little bit of the Buddha story of how the Buddha too engaged in very extreme tapas before his liberation. So this is just the beginning in chapter 1 for them. There's a flash of light, they're still confused, and then Narayana first speaks, and then Shiva speaks. And by the end, maybe they're Jivan Muktas too, it doesn't say exactly, right? You'd think they were already, someone like Kapila who founded the Samkhya school, you'd think he was already liberated, but in this text he's not yet. Maybe it's just they're pretending because we're not Jivan Muktas and they want to help us, but I can't say for sure. But what I can say is, from the way you describe it, is Ramakrishna very clearly is a Jivan Mukta, someone who is already liberated even while embodied. Not all Hindus believe this. So Ramanuja and the Vishishtadvaita tradition says there's no such thing as Jivan Mukti. It's impossible. Even as long as we have a body, there's always some impurity or something keeping us from liberation. But the majority of traditions, including, Vivekananda's tradition, including the Pashupatas too, they believe in Jivan Mukti, that one can have a body and be in this world and still be completely liberated. So that is, I think, Ramakrishna. Yeah.
Professor Nicholson, thank you for the talk. I have two questions. Actually, I seek two clarification.
Okay.
One is when we talk about Isvara Gita and
Yes.
the context that you set up,
Yes.
I'd be curious to know what's the role of Shakti in this whole talk, because often Shiv and Shakti
Yes.
are understood as one and
This
the
is
same.
true.
And the other question is, when you mentioned Kaundinya, Rishi Kaundinya,
Yeah.
and some of his definitions of what yoga is, as
Yes.
well as some commentary on Panchartha Bhashya. Now, is this the same Kaundinya that is understood to be one of the first followers of Gautama Buddha and becomes an arhat? It's
Different.
not that.
No.
Okay.
This is the problem. They don't have last names in ancient India, right? So it's not that Kaundinya, it's not that Shankara, it's this other Shankara, it's this other Kaundinya. We have this problem constantly. So no, different Kaundinya. But the first question was Shakti. This is an interesting question. So the traditions of goddess worship or Shakta Tantrism came a little bit later than this text. And we really, perhaps shockingly, find very little about the goddess in this text. They do use the word Shakti a lot. Shakti, of course, is a feminine word. It means power. And so they're often talking about the Shaktis that a god will possess. So his ability to create the world or create illusory forms, these are all considered Shaktis. And this text actually talks about the three Shaktis of Lord Ishvara being Brahma, Narayana, and Rudra. So Rudra you can think of as the destructive Shakti, the destructive power of God to end the world at this cycle. Narayana is his Shakti, his power of maintaining the world, and then Brahma is his Shakti of creating the world. But these are masculine gods. Where are the goddesses, right? I'm afraid if you're looking for goddesses, this is not the text for you. And some other background on some of so the Pashupatas were notorious for some other reasons. Kaundinya, for instance, thought it was inappropriate for women to be part of this Pashupata tradition. And he actually says, when a Pashupata encounters urine, feces, an outcast, or a woman, he should do pranayama to purify himself. So this is misogyny, right? That's what that's called. And I'm afraid there are a lot of ascetic traditions that tended toward misogyny. You find it in early Buddhism as well, where women are seen as their sole reason to live is to tempt these celibate Buddhist monks to abandon their vows. So brahmacharya was a very important vow for the Pashupatas, and we can understand why, from the perspective of 16-year-old guy smeared in ashes, just the presence of a woman is threatening to him. So you can understand, I'm not trying to excuse it obviously, but you can understand why so many ascetic traditions in India would tend at least sometimes towards misogyny. I'm happy to report the Isvara Gita follows the Bhagavad Gita in opening up liberation to women and outcasts, as we mentioned, svapaka, dog cookers. So it's not just for Brahmins. It's not just for Brahmin males. Everyone, through this devotion, through Atmaishvara Samyoga, has access to Shiva. So this is another way I would say that Isvara Gita is, from my perspective at least, superior to Kaundinya's commentary, because Kaundinya was a misogynist, unrepentant misogynist. The Isvara Gita, although it is very focused on men, all the sages are men, there are no female sages mentioned, nonetheless, at least it opens the possibility for women to achieve liberation. But these really goddess-centric traditions that we find, like Saundarya Lahari, this famous text that is ascribed to Shankara, came a few centuries after these texts. And goddess worship really flourished, I would say, in the second millennium of the Common Era. That's my perspective as a historian. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor.
Yes.
I'm curious about the second stage that you described, where one has to accept abuse as part of their spiritual practice.
Yes.
And in the Bible also, we see in the Gospel of Matthew, "Blessed are ye who are reviled for me,"
right.
So, can you elaborate on that or provide some practical insights on how would you apply that in this age?
I don't think I can give you any personal insights into that because I haven't, I'm not a member of the Pashupata sect. I haven't done that. But it's interesting. I mean, this is another reason why other sects in ancient India made fun of the Pashupatas. Most of what we know from the Pashupatas is not from their mouths. It's from other people saying nasty things about them. And one of the most outrageous things from the perspective of these other groups was, how dare you go and act like a crazy person and make these lewd gestures to women and do these things that are socially unacceptable. And I guess what I was trying to do is give some context for why that should be a practice that anyone might think would lead to spiritual uplift or be a part of any spiritual path. But the fact is we do find in many traditions, so this is pre-tantric, but certainly once you see tantric traditions in India, tantric Buddhism, tantric Shaivism, you see very similar sorts of things. We call it crazy wisdom in English, right? Where these guys are doing things that are violating the yamas and the niyamas, right? But I think the important thing to understand is they're not doing it just because they're enjoying themselves or because they get a kick out of it or because they're weirdos or they have some fetish or something, right? I think, nowadays you find kapalikas in India. Some of you may have run into these people, the guys who carry bowls made out of human skulls, and they embrace impurity and basically whatever the Dharma Shastra, whatever laws of Manu tells you to do, you do exactly the opposite of that. So you're sort of embracing impurity. These guys don't go that far. They're very concerned with purity, actually. So this is very clearly not that. But still, you do find these traditions in Buddhism, Hinduism, not so much in Jainism, but that embrace things that are considered socially unacceptable by mainstream society. And there are different reasons for that. So if you're a non-dualist, like a non-dualist Shaiva, you'd say, well, how can this disgusting substance I'm consuming, how can it really defile me if I am nothing but Shiva? If the whole world is just Shiva, then if I pick up this dog dew and eat it, it doesn't matter. It's not going to defile me because it's all just Shiva, right? Or tantric intercourse. I'm sure, people, whenever you go talk about tantra, everyone brings up sex. That's not primarily what tantra was about, but certainly in some of these non-dual tantric traditions, they did have traditions of intercourse, often with low-caste women. So these would be defiling forms of sexual intercourse. If you think, haha, I'm having sex, this is so fun, that's not the spiritual path, right? You have to understand this as leading to a realization of non-dualism, non-dual reality. And these debates also exist in Tantric Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism. Is it ever acceptable to break one's monastic vows in order to achieve a kind of non-dual awareness? And so that's a later understanding of breaking the norms of purity and pollution. Here, they're not so much violating purity norms. In fact, they're very concerned with purity as finding a way to diminish the ego that says, look at me, I am this spiritual master, I know so much philosophy, and I have done so much yoga, and I'm so much better than everyone else. It's to attempt to kind of diminish the ego, or to, as Kaundinya says, regard praise as a poison. And people who have been fortunate, like I have, to win awards, and it's dangerous because your ego gets inflated. You become the head of some monastic order or something, and we all know these people who are full of this kind of pride and spiritual materialism. So I think the best way, perhaps, for me to understand what they were trying to do is a way of diminishing one's spiritual materialism, as Chogyam Trungpa called it, getting out of the sense of, look at me, I'm the big person, I know everything, I'm so advanced, and instead understanding that you're not, you're just, a little particle of Shiva, that's all you are, really, which is enough. That's good, right? But you're no bigger than anyone else. So I think that is, from my perspective, the best way to understand this second stage of the Pashupata vow.
Okay. Thank you.
Professor?
Yes.
Did you come up with the phrase spiritual materialism?
This is not mine. This is Chogyam Trungpa's. Yes, he's a famous teacher. He started a form of teaching called Shambhala Buddhism, or just Shambhala, actually. But it's a good book. I think it speaks not just to people following a Buddhist path, but more generally the kinds of pitfalls that one can experience when one is on a kind of spiritual journey. And so it is, I think, a useful book. So Chogyam Trungpa. It's called Cutting Off Spiritual Materialism.
Thank you so much. That was an interesting talk. You mentioned several practices of these Pashupatas with the ultimate goal of attaining Jivan Mukti, and that Jivan Mukti was an accepted state. Is there anything mentioned in terms of what the attributes of such a Jivan Mukta would be in this tradition? I mean, would they still practice all those things, or would they be transformed to be different types of individuals?
That's tricky. I mean, this is a kind of constant practical question, right? Is how can we trust one guru over another guru? Everyone claims to have these spiritual attainments. I think probably one good way is the guy who's claiming all the spiritual attainments, he's not the one you should follow, right? You should follow the one who's not saying, I can do this, I can do that, look at me, I can make a ring appear out of thin air or something. But I mean, these texts are not practical in some of the ways we would like. So once you get to the end of the path, they don't talk a lot about what happens next. Perhaps you can't talk about what happens next. Perhaps these things go beyond language. But it's clear to these texts and to me that there are certain people who have at least achieved this status and still exist and are among us in this world. So they clearly say that is the case. But unfortunately, I can't tell you like what are the 5 marks of a true Shaiva guru versus a false Shaiva guru. I mean, that's something you're not going to find in these texts in particular. Buddhist traditions, they do talk about different marks of the Buddha. Oftentimes they're extraordinary things like long earlobes or a swirl on the top of the head with a top knot. But, as a practical matter, the Pashupatas did not give us that much guidance. Like I said, it's surprising that all these sages themselves weren't Jivan Muktas at the beginning of this text. So perhaps they, had a ways to go. Honestly, I can't give you any practical guidance from these texts. Am I answering? Is there anything else like you're looking for specifically? Or?
I was just sort of I believe in the Bhagavad Gita, if I'm not mistaken, Swamiji, there is some mention made of what the qualities of such a an individual might
Right.
be. So I figured perhaps this has
Right.
some similar mention.
Well, as far as Bhagavad Gita, they don't use the word jivan mukta, but they do use stita prajna. Someone whose prajna, whose wisdom is stita, is firm. And there's someone who, according to the Bhagavad Gita, no matter what they're doing, and they might be doing all sorts of things. They might be, cooking your meal at the cafeteria. They might be fighting in a war. So the Bhagavad Gita's great insight, I think, is that even while we are engaged in our normal daily tasks that we're required to do, one can still have this kind of pure insight, prajna, and bring that to these tasks. Interestingly, the Isvara Gita is not that concerned with this particular, following through on your dharma. And I think the reason for that is the milieu of the Bhagavad Gita was a bunch of kshatriyas, a bunch of warriors in the middle of a battlefield, who needed to know, how can I do my job, which is, in some cases, killing people, and still feel that I am, a spiritual being who can be on the path to moksha. And so Krishna is giving a very tailored teaching to Arjuna for that reason. These guys are not that. These are all sages. They're done with all of that business of worrying about their varnashrama dharma, right? So they are achieving a moksha through tapas and other forms of yoga. And so for them, perhaps a different teaching is required. And that's why I think one of the reasons perhaps Bhagavad Gita is so famous is most of us, we are grihastas, right? We have jobs, we have families. And so that text speaks directly to people like that, like Arjuna, who grihastas, who have all these duties. How can we fulfill our spiritual potential even in the midst of all these duties that we have that don't seem very spiritual at all most of the time? For the Isvara Gita, these guys are retired. They're not worried about their jobs anymore. They're off at an ashram meditating. So perhaps their stage of life is a little bit different than most of us who are sitting here in this room today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. A wonderful presentation and a very good Q&A. About the sages, I was just thinking how the Isvara Gita begins. Sometimes what happens is that we have seen it in our own monastery. Pretty advanced monks, when they're asking the teacher or, say, the head of the organization, the president of the order, so they know the answers, but they ask it all over again so that we can all hear those answers. And they also might get new insights. So that might be a kind of... it's great when great people ask these questions and someone even greater answers it, and that gives us a lot of shraddha, a lot of foundation. Yeah. And it magnifies the glory of the teaching too. About the second stage, when you are criticized and abused, I was just thinking, in the life of Saint Francis of Assisi, the little flower, you find he would send out the people who joined the Franciscan order, into the village square to be scorned and to be criticized, so that the ego is reduced. Sri Ramakrishna himself would say, in Bengali, lajja ghrina bhoy teen thakte noy. That means that three things which are standard for any decent, grown-up, mature person in society: a sense of shame, a sense of disgust for disgusting things, and a sense of fear, so that you can lead a typical householder's life. But one must also internally at least transgress these things. These tend to be fetters. And about the dancing part of it, I just was thinking, Sri Ramakrishna would insist, especially those who were very full of themselves or a little dignified, to sing and join in the singing and dancing. And Sri Ramakrishna criticizes M, that M is a little shy, so he doesn't want to join in the singing and dancing. And he says, look at him. He can go and show his teeth to schoolboys. He was a school teacher. He can go and perform in front of schoolboys, but he can't sing in the name of God or dance in the name of God. So Sri Ramakrishna would insist on that, the singing and dancing. And about how do you practice getting reviled and scorned in today's age, I think you can get trolled on the internet or something like that. Anyway, thank you very much.